about the gender. The whole year he has been working on it. And he's a Belmont graduate, he's a local guy, and he's trans himself, and there is nobody better than him to educate us, tell us, make us feel comfortable, and let us know all about what the gender revolution is all about. Therefore, I'm hoping that this will be a very educational and useful session for all of us. Welcome, Jace, and the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the very kind words. I love doing that event and getting to meet you. I'm very happy to be with all of you today and get to meet you as well. So this is our Trans 101 session and ways to show support. As he said, my name is Jace or Jason, either one that you prefer to call me. And I am currently presenting this on behalf of Tennessee Equality Project. Along with GLSEN, what we do is work to provide education resources that are accessible to the community. So one of the first things I like to do is just set ground rules. I have a feeling this will not be a problem with this group whatsoever, but the expectations are just to be respectful, realizing that, you may know much more about this topic than your neighbor, or you may know none of this at all. And both are 100% okay, but just being respectful of your neighbor and both. Be open. Some of this may be incredibly new information and may be jarring at first if you haven't been introduced to it. So just kind of keep that in mind that some of it may be very new. Be curious. I love questions. Please ask questions, but also be mindful, which is that if you feel like you don't understand something in a way that may be offensive or something, you're not quite sure, feel free. I will give my information at the end. You can also ask me offline if you're afraid that what you're going to ask might be offensive in any way. But again, just be mindful and be curious. So I like to start off with this about how language and why it matters. One of the things that really divides the humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom is how we use language. We all have specialized language that we use within our communities, and that differs on geographic location, the people that we're around. But the biggest thing is that the way that we use language shows support and respect to the other person. One of the things that's important is this is how we also gender our language. And language gives that sense of humanity. So when we take that away from somebody, when we take away the language that they use to describe themselves, such as I identify as male, despite the fact that I was born as female, but you say that I am not male, you're taking away that language. Therefore, you're also taking away that power of humanity, that thing that gives us an even ground. So language matters because it gives us both that sense of humanity, gives us that self-esteem, gives us that ability to communicate with each other and continue to grow together. So that's why we're going to be really focusing on language and how to use it throughout this session, is because it's going to help us understand what we can do with it later and how powerful it actually is when talking about the trans community. So I like to make this joke. It's funny to exactly one person, and that's me, which is that I will be using qualitative data to support quantitative research on transgender lived experiences, AKA my own personal experience throughout this, alongside some actual citations. So just be aware of that. And first and foremost, we're going to go over some definitions just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and it all helps us kind of understand more of what we're doing going forward. So first, I want to describe gender identity. In my opinion, this is one of the most important definitions to understand for the rest of this lesson, which is gender identity is the way in which a person identifies or expresses their gender, including self-image, appearance, and embodiment of gender roles. The most important part of that definition is self-image. That person that you wake up as and that you go to bed as is the person that you are. So if my self-image, which it is for me, is that of male, then that is the gender identity I carry. My appearance reflects that in the ways that are stereotypical in society, and I embody those gender roles. I embody that gender identity of male, even though my sex assigned at birth was female. So that self-image overcomes basically all those other aspects at the end of the day about that psychology mentality. Then we're going to talk about the term transgender. This is an umbrella term that is used to describe the full spectrum of people who exist, who have different gender identities that may go outside of the sex they were assigned at birth, which we'll talk about momentarily. And we also like to emphasize that the term transgender is an adjective, not a noun. So how we use that is saying that she is transgender or she identifies as a trans woman instead of saying that this person, instead of saying she's transgendered or she has transgenderisms, things like that. And one of the facts that I like to put in here that I think is very important to kind of put into prospect of how much research we still need to do is that estimated right now, we see about 25 million trans people worldwide, but that is also not recognizing low income and middle income countries for the most part, as most don't have any kind of system to help create that census for transgender individuals, especially in states and places where it is actually illegal. So there are actually probably many more, but as far as we know of, there's at least 25 million transgender people worldwide. This is a term that I will be using throughout the lesson as well, which is the term cisgender. All that means is everyone else who is not transgender. It means that if you were assigned male at birth and you still identify as male, congratulations, you are cisgender. It just means that you are not transgender. Now we're going to talk about the term sex. As we all know, sex is that biological status that is determined at birth. And typically it's categorized into 3 categories, which is male, female, or intersex. There are many indicators, but the one that we most chronically use at birth to determine someone's sex would be the genitalia, or that secondary sex characteristic that we see, or primary sex characteristic we see at birth. The issue for transgender people and for those who are intersex, which we'll talk about in a moment, is that this goes against kind of like their experiences, that they may develop hormonally differently. They may have a brain structure that we see in transgender individuals that is different from the sex they are assigned at birth. So for example, brain scans have been done on transgender men that show that their brain structure is more male than female, even though they are assigned female at birth. And so many other factors that end up actually going into sex throughout their entire life outside of that primary sex characteristic that we identify at birth. So that's why we also say sex assigned at birth when talking about transgender people, because of that mismatch between their gender identity, how they experience the world, and the sex that they were told that they were based off of one factor of sex at birth. Now we're going to talk about 3 terms that kind of all fall under the idea of gender diversity that are also important to talk about. As you heard me say, the 3rd option for sex is intersex. Some of these individuals end up identifying as transgender, but they may not. That's because at birth, they have a sexual anatomy that doesn't fit male or female. So what this may mean is that they may end up having surgery at birth to try and correct that anomaly, or they may just be assigned a sex that is determined to be closer to what the genitalia looks like. But because it is not fully determinable, they may actually develop later in life as the other sex because of hormones, chromosomes that develop, things like that. This is something that is almost more understandable because we can physically see it. With being transgender, sometimes it's harder to understand because we cannot physically see the same things that we see in intersex individuals, but both of them identify with being sex variants or having that gender identity that may go outside of what they are assigned at birth. And that brings us to the last term in kind of our umbrella under transgender is non-binary. This is an individual who, again, going on that whole idea of, there's only male or going only female, science doesn't like to work like that all the time. There may be a 99% rule, like for example, with the idea of cisgender people being the majority of the population, but there's always the exceptional 1% that makes science more of a spectrum rather than a strict binary. Hence the term non-binary, which is someone who doesn't actually fit the full definition of male or female. In different cultures, this is called different things. So for example, in Native American culture, some people who are what we would call two-spirit are equivalent to the idea of non-binary in modern American culture. And then finally, gender dysphoria. This is what actually tells us that someone is transgender, which is that discomfort or distress that is related to someone's gender identity, the relationship to sex assigned at birth, the performance of their gender, and or those secondary primary sex characteristics. This is the main difference between someone who may just be expressing themselves differently than what is societally expected versus someone who is actually transgender. There is an actual distress or discomfort that actually occurs. So before we move on to our next section and stop for questions for a moment, I'm going to bring you through a few terms that I have heard over the years that have been used that may be outdated and kind of give you the more up-to-date or correct terms, so to say. So first and foremost is transsexual or transsexualism. This was commonly used in the 50s, especially when the first medical journals involving transgender people came about, because it used to be that if you were transgender, the only way to be recognized whatsoever is if you had a full medical transition. This is not exactly possible because you guys are all here, meaning that you've all dealt with the medical system at some point. It's very expensive. It's very hard to access. And doctors are always not available for this kind of specialty. So to say that someone is only valid in identifying with another gender if they've had medical procedures doesn't encompass the entire experience of the community. So the term transgender is more accepted. Transgendered, transgenderism, and transgenders. The reason for this is that going back to that idea of kind of humanity, where we want to kind of remind ourselves in a way that this is a describer of a transgender person. When we say things like transgenders, we kind of underlie that humanity aspect. And unfortunately, terms like transgendered or transgenders have also been politicized and actually used to dehumanize transgender individuals. So sometimes when my community hears other people hear it, they kind of make maybe a false assumption that that person is not an ally or that they should be afraid of them, because it's been used to dehumanize transgender people by calling them these terms. So transgender person or transgender man, transgender woman is more preferred. Preferred pronouns and preferred gender. Preferred's not like the worst thing you could say. It's just like not necessary. You can say pronouns, you can say gender. If you need to specify, you can always say true gender or the gender that they're living as now, things like that. But it's just like a little nitpick kind of thing. Real men and real women, as we kind of described, sex does not always equal gender. And when we say real men and real women, specifically, especially when we're talking about transgender people, we are ousting them from the rest of the population. And we're telling them that they aren't who they say they are. And this can have detrimental effects, especially for transgender youth who are already struggling mentally with depression and anxiety because of that gender dysphoria. So by repeating back to them that they will never be a real man or a real woman does cause some issues. And then finally, gender incongruence or gender identity disorder. We just like to make a correction that gender dysphoria is the commonly used term from the DSM-5 as of currently. These past two definitions were used in previous DSMs, but the DSM-5 recognizes gender dysphoria and is the common medical term. So I'm going to stop for a moment. I know I just threw a lot at you. If you have any questions about terms, I will take questions about terms right now, and then we will move on into our next session, which talks about support.
Please, when you're asking any questions, please unmute your mic. Your mics are muted. Unmute your mic before you ask the question.
Can you tell us why you were eliminating the preferred gender rather than just gender?
Right. So just to specify on that, So the reason why I say just call it gender or just call it pronouns is because in transgender people's minds, it's not preferred, it just is. You know, like I'm not asking for a preference, I'm just saying my gender actually is, or my pronouns actually are. So that's kind of why we kind of, again, it's more a nitpicky thing. It just kind of also helps eliminate that language as well.
Any other questions? The people are still thinking about it, Jason. They will have a lot of questions later on.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think we want to hear the full story, and then maybe you might already answer some of the questions more thoroughly during your full lecture.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, of course, too. So, all right. So I like to also give a little fun fact break before we get into kind of the more niche stuff. So one of the things that I decided to bring out for this was actually Shabnam Bano was the first transgender person in India to be elected to public office. She became an elected member in 1998 all the way to 2003. And this was 10 years prior to when India recognized transgender people legally. She helped kind of educate throughout the years about eunuchs, hijras, and transgender people. And there's actually a 2005 film, which I need to watch now, about her. That is just her name. But I think we all need to watch it now. So I just thought that was a nice little fun fact. All right, so now for more of our kind of statistics area, I am going to tell you right now, not every statistic is on this slide. Some of the things I'm going to have to say verbally because there is so much, unfortunately, around issues of depression, anxiety, mental health disorders, and physical ailments in the transgender community. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is that this is from GLSEN in 2018. Transgender students were more likely to report feelings of depressive symptoms by 47% versus their cisgender counterparts or people who don't identify as transgender who only experience it 9.5%. So that is a huge gap. Almost half of transgender students report feeling depressive symptoms versus 9.5 of their counterparts. There's a range of factors that play into this, which includes those fears of victimization. This can include anywhere from fearing harassment in the workplace, fearing harassment in school, fearing harassment on the street, all the way to issues with, especially for transgender women and especially for transgender women of color, which is sexual violence, especially as many transgender women end up having to rely on sex work because of discrimination and harassment in normal workplaces, based off of the fact that they may not always look stereotypically feminine because they were born as male. This includes and furthers into invalidation and non-support from family members as well. So, and this it reaches out into the community too. So when family members refuse or reject to accept their children, we actually see a spike in suicide attempts. About 40% of transgender youth will attempt suicide before the age of 25. But when we look deeper into that, almost 80% of those individuals had faced family rejection. And it gets even higher when you see how many of those youth faced homelessness because of family rejection. There's a lot more struggles that are put into that, such as higher risk of substance abuse disorder, higher risk of HIV and AIDS, again, because of having to rely on sex work or getting into groups that are drug users as well, for community, looking for community, and inability to get work because of lack of educational attainment, especially for those children who suffer from homelessness because of family rejection. This gets even worse when we talk about loneliness and alienation and stress caused by gender dysphoria. As you can see, it just kind of keeps piling up and getting higher, and we can see why this risk factor exists. But that loneliness and alienation comes from a lot of different things. What we've seen, particularly in the South, is that because of rural communities, not only is the family rejection factor a huge problem, because of kind of like older beliefs or religious beliefs that may come about, but also because of how spread apart rural communities are and the stigma in those communities. It's harder for trans children to feel safe and welcome. And then stress just related to experiencing gender dysphoria, because as you can imagine, being born in a body that doesn't feel right, that feels wrong, especially on such a fundamental level with the idea of gender, comes that stress related to gender dysphoria. This leads to a really interesting thing that I found from a study in 2018 that is called the stigma to sickness slope. As many of you probably already know from ideas such as social determinants of health, if you identify with being in a minority group and identify with lower socioeconomic factors, things like that, that all adds up to equal down to more likely to experience physical ailments and more likely to suffer because of those. This is not unique to the trans community. In fact, it's very common. And it starts with basically the stigma bringing to discrimination, harassment, and exclusion. And that all leads down to more issues that spread out, such as drastic drops in socioeconomic opportunities. So again, from lack of educational attainment, because for children that feel threatened at school especially, they have a larger amount of absenteeism, they have lower test scores, they're more likely to drop out, and only 30% of trans people will actually finish their degree at any point in their life because of this kind of harassment, meaning that we see, again, that socioeconomic opportunity drop, which also leads to inability to access healthcare. And we see that over 50% of trans people have to actually explain to their doctor even what transgender means. So this often leads back to that isolation feeling and that alienation of feeling like you can't even go to a medical professional and talk about your needs because of this. And then that can lead to just not going to the doctor because of financial reasons and because of that rejection, leading to living with physical ailments and unfortunately a lot shorter lifespan. A very shocking statistic is that Black trans women specifically have a life expectancy of only 35 years old. That is absolutely jarring. A lot of that has to do with sexual violence, again, that socioeconomic loss and homelessness factors because of all of these things. And it all adds together to affect mental health. One of the things I wanted to highlight though, because this is something that I'm asked about a lot, is why can't, someone just wait till adulthood or, maybe just not transition? If they're gonna lose all of this, why would they transition? What we have seen and what we have proven from all these other factors though, from the stress of gender dysphoria and things, is that it's not the transition as the problem. It's a societal reaction, and that there's actually a lot more risk with delaying transition, which doesn't, again, always mean medical transition, just means coming out and living as yourself. There's a lot more risk with not transitioning and living as yourself than there is with just doing it, even with all of these other negative aspects that still come out. So,
May I?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, what is in these statistics, what is the usual age group, the earliest age group that one feels that they're different? And when is the time that they approach either the parents or the physician?
That's a wonderful question. So according to kind of like child development, the idea of gender identity develops as early as 2 to 3 years old. That's when we first start kind of getting that idea of where we belong. And that can actually be as early as some children will report feelings. Now, parents usually don't immediately react to this, especially the fact that, it's not solidified. But around the age of 6 or 7, when we still continue to see, a preference for being called, for example, if we have someone who is born female like I was, and they insist on being called a boy, and now they're 7, 8 years old, they have started to solidify that sense of self. Even if it isn't a full sense of identity, they have started to fully come into self. And by those prepubescent years into the pubescent years, that's when identity, according to the those same child development stages, that's when identity really flourishes, and people tend to come out during that time. Some kids will come out earlier. You probably have seen stories maybe online of kids who come out at like 7 or 8. That's not as common, but it does happen. But kids will usually start coming around those pubescent to pubescent years. And that's usually when also doctors will at least have a conversation. They will usually never get medically involved until the age of 16, when the child and the parent can both consent. Before the age of 16, it's not very common that you'll see anything involved unless they feel it's absolutely necessary, and it has to fall within those hormonal puberty kind of stages as well. So if it's not appropriate for a child to start hormones until they're 18 or 19, a doctor is not going to allow that child to start until they're an adult. But if it does seem appropriate at the age of 16 at that limit, then they will do that with the consent of the parent, and usually with psychological intervention as well. A lot of doctors, especially if it's below the age of 18, require at least one counselor to diagnose the child with gender dysphoria. I think in Tennessee, the common practice is actually at least 2. And then for any surgeries, even above the age of 18, you do have to have at least the 1 letter from a therapist that confirms that there's no other psychological factor that can be influencing this, such as like dissociative states or something, which is a lot more rare and, totally different topic within itself. But just to kind of like clarify those things. So to shorten that answer, basically the very earliest probably would be like 3 years old. More common 7 to puberty, so like 7 to 13. And then medical intervention 16 and beyond, but usually people will start like more so transitioning after the age of 18.
When does the surgical intervention starts?
That also is very dependent on the relationship with the doctor. 16 is like the legal, like unless there is something that says that they absolutely need it. For example, like if they are suffering beyond basically comprehension from gender dysphoria, the lowest that they would go is maybe 15, but I think it's most ethically recognized that 16 is the absolute earliest. Again, parent consent and therapeutic intervention first, which isn't usually just one visit to a therapist, it's multiple visits before a diagnosis is made with gender dysphoria.
Okay, any other questions? I think we'll move around. I think we'll go ahead and listen.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about support, especially again, I started this off with talking about how important language is, and that was for a very important reason, because as I was just talking about, medical transition is usually not the first step whatsoever. The very first step that happens is the coming out process and what we call social transition, which is when a person starts living as the gender that they identify as. So this can mean for a child, it can just mean changing the clothes that they wear to fit more of the societal norms, or changing the name and the pronouns that they use. One of the things that I found incredible was that just by using the correct pronouns and using the correct name for trans folks, you help reduce symptoms of depression by 71%. And you can see a 65% decrease in suicide attempts for trans folks that have people around them that are using the correct name and pronouns, because it so heavily decreases those feelings of discomfort and distress that comes with not having their gender match how they feel inside. Again, that self-image. So some of the ways that I kind of highlighted that can be done on any level that can help out with this is, of course, giving space for choosing a name, especially like families. It can actually be kind of fun to help a child choose a new name. I know that my mom actually had a lot of fun breaking out the baby books. So, and then asking about changes in pronouns or preferred language, because the one expert in this situation is the transgender person. So if they say that they want to identify as a woman, you can ask, would you like me to use female pronouns, she, her pronouns for you? And, they can respond from there. Other things, especially again with family, is helping change of clothes, and especially like religious attire. Especially, I had a conversation and helped the family out recently that were at a synagogue, and they ended up giving their transgender son a kippah, and it was like the best day of his life because he finally got to wear that to synagogue, and it made him feel so comfortable and so safe. And then having honest conversations with the trans folks in your life about concerns, questions, and finding support groups, not just for them, but for yourself as well. So this is one of the biggest things, because I feel like we get very nervous about having honest conversations, especially if we feel like it's a touchy subject, but that can actually create more trust if you're able to clarify things with that person, asking respectful questions, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. And in finding those support groups, again, especially as parents or family members of trans folks, it's important to not just support them, but be able to support yourself in those struggles that you may have. Because if I'm going to be honest, gender transition, because of how embedded gender is in our lives, is very stressful for everyone. Even if it's a joyous experience for the trans person, it can still be stressful for them. So helping find support for both of you is also incredibly important. Continuing to educate yourself. As you can see by the list that I provided before about kind of corrections of terminology, we are in that gender revolution of changing language, of understanding all these terms. And that means that they may also evolve in the next 10 years, and my list may be completely wrong. So it's incredibly important to kind of continue to try and educate yourself. I am more than happy to send out resources, but some great resources that there are to kind of discuss identity and understand allyship includes GLSEN, who I'm doing the fellowship with, who provides K through 12 information about how to support kids in the classroom. Human Rights Campaign, which provides a guide basically around why it's important to support transgender people in your life. Trans Equality, which provides more information, and an ACLU, which provides more legal protection and information as well. And one of the things I like to remind people is that there's no such thing as a perfect ally. Just do your best. You're going to mess up, and that's okay. It's about being honest and correcting yourself when you realize it. And again, continuing those conversations. Now for kind of more of the, if you want to go the extra mile kind of thing, which is about providing affirmative spaces. So this can start from your community level. This would be including starting something like what we call a gay straight alliance or a gender and sexuality alliance. This allows for space, especially for transgender children, but also can be formatted for transgender adults as a trans support group or an LGBT support group in your community. Help sponsor one to give them a safe space to discuss these issues without having to fear if there's going to be harm because of it. Tolerance is not the same thing as acceptance. This is one of the most important things I have to say, because of the fact that I think often we kind of see, okay, I tolerate you, that's enough, but it's truly not. Again, going back to that equality of humanity, just because I tolerate you doesn't mean I accept you, and that's important. So improving language to be inclusive in lessons, sermons, policies is all important. This can sometimes be difficult because sometimes it slips our minds, but sometimes helping by including gender neutral language. So for example, instead of saying in a group, brothers and sisters, maybe just saying siblings, or in policies, trying to make sure that there's a policy that's included either in your company or wherever you are that includes protections for LGBT individuals, that allows for and makes sure that there's a space for transgender people to use the restroom, especially if they don't feel safe, maybe using the restroom in just the men or women's area, if it's possible, things like that. Making sure that there are inclusive policies that will allow for someone's gender transition to not be as difficult. And that includes like name change policies. So if it's possible in the workplace for someone to change their name, that's also incredibly important. And in the healthcare space, especially for patients, having the ability to have a patient change their name in documents so they get called the right thing and the right pronouns very helpful. And last but not least, very short but very sweet, advocate for your neighbor. Understanding that their success is your success too is very helpful. When we make policies or pass laws that discriminate against one group, it affects everyone at the end of the day. So when we limit healthcare access, when we limit sports access, when we limit all these things to transgender folks, we do honestly kind of limit it for ourselves as well. So supporting your neighbor and advocating for them, especially the fact that transgender people are still a considerably small group, is incredibly important because we're all in this together. Now, before I kind of get into my last slide, I want to do a quick little practice. You can give it a try in the chat. You can say it out loud to yourself or unmuted, but I wanted to kind of give you a chance to practice this. One of the ways that I find that is the easiest way to tell someone that you are a safe person, and especially in an environment where you know that there may be transgender people, which again, we can never assume, but especially in those spaces where we need to make sure it's a safe space for everybody, is by simply introducing yourself with your name, but also introducing yourself with the pronouns that you use. So if you identify as male, you're probably going to use he and him pronouns. If you identify as female, you're probably going to use she and her pronouns. And for people who are considered non-binary, they would use usually singular they pronouns. So they would use they, them pronouns. So if I were to do it, I would say, hello, my name is Jason Wilder. My pronouns are he, him, and or they, them. I say that because some people aren't sure what my gender is, so I want to make sure it's okay. If they mess up and they want to use that, they have both options. You don't have to do that. You can introduce yourself however you're comfortable, but I would like to either see it in the chat or give it a shot on your own. I'll give you a minute to do that.
Hey, Jace, Dr. Patel here. Question, comment. So the he and him, I understand, to me, it seems straightforward, but people who may not have assigned gender, the they, them, why not come up with a new word? Because it is confusing, they, them, at least to me, because I'm not used to that.
So yes, there actually are a few varieties, but so singular they, them, even though not very commonly used outside of the trans community, has been around since about the 1300s as like a gender neutral pronoun, and it's been adopted in the past, like I would say honestly like century by trans people for that, because in literature it used to be used to be gender neutral. So it has been kind of adopted that way, but I can definitely see how it's confusing. But it would be used in the same way that you would use they and them. You would just be using it for that one person instead of addressing a group. I hope does that clarify?
Oh, yes, I understand it completely, but I was wondering why the committee didn't come up with another word. I didn't know it had a historical background to it.
Yeah. And you actually will see from some people who identify outside of like, again, that non-binary group or intersex even sometimes, there are different pronouns. You'll see sometimes, you'll see an X and an E together, that's pronounced Z. Some people use that as well. It's not as common, but it still is there. So some people have kind of created their own options. And again, like I said, that language is continuing to evolve. And like I said, my list may be outdated in 10 years because of that, because the language is revolutionizing. So maybe in 10 years, you'll see more of that as well.
Another follow-up question, not about he or him, but just the actual name of the person. Do transgender people often change their name as later on they identify with a different sex, or they keep the same name? And if they change the names, a preferred group of names, like John usually goes with a male, or Janet usually goes with a female, just for my education?
Yeah, so more commonly than not, more trans people will change their name to usually kind of a name that is more associated with the gender that they're identifying as in that society. So for example, like my birth name is not Jason. So because I was born female, but I use the name Jason because it's masculine and I like the name. For those who identify as non-binary, they may find a name that can be used for both female and male individuals, such as a name like, I just think of like fox or something like that, that can really be used either way. But more likely than not, you will see a name change and they will ask to use a different name that they have chosen.
Thank you.
Since you talked about your personal situation, Jason, at what age did you realize you are not female?
Oh, that's a good question. So I had the realization pretty early on where I never quite, it's weird to describe it, but I almost like from a very early age did not understand the concept of gender. Where, by the age of like kindergarten, stuff like that, when the teacher would say, okay, boys over here, girls over here, I would kind of just be like, okay, I think I'm a boy, but also like I've been told I'm supposed to be going over on this side of the room. So it was like confusing for me. The first time I fully understood what I was feeling and had a term for it was probably around the age of 10. And the first time I had expressed that to my mom was around the age of 11. So I started coming out then, and it took a long time because, if I'm being honest, my mom wouldn't mind me saying this because she's grown a lot around it as well and learned a lot. In the past 10 years, she's learned a lot, but it's only been within the past like maybe 2 or 3 that she has understood it enough to use the correct pronouns and the correct name as well, because she had a lot to unlearn as well. So I first kind of had an idea without having the term around the age of like 5 or 6. First started coming out around the age of 10 when I found that term, and then started medically transitioning when I was about to turn 19. And I'm 21 now, so.
And your parents kind of initially, how did they respond to all this?
Yeah, so my mom originally was very, very much like, absolutely not. Was like, why would you? Because she didn't understand, and that's understandable because my mom was raised in New York. She was born in the 60s, and she was raised in New York. And in her family, it's very much women do this job, men do this job, and there is no question about it. So to go outside of those gender roles was wild to her. And so to change your gender was an inconceivable concept. And it took years of conversations, a few arguments for sure, and a lot of patience on her part for her to understand fully what it meant and accept it. And then she came to me one day and she had this realization that she told me. She was like, nothing has really changed about you except for the name and the pronouns I use for you. You are still the same child that I raised and that I grew up with me. You just are a different gender, and that's okay. It doesn't change, my expectations of you graduating college. It just changes how I refer to you.
A lot of parents, they're in a denial, and they say, "Hey, you're okay."
Yeah, for so many different reasons too. That's the unique part, is that for some parents, they feel as though their religious background makes it so that they cannot accept the child. For some individuals, it's the culture that they grew up around. Again, like that strict gender role identity, or the strict ideas around gender and stuff like that, that my generation doesn't fully adopt. And so many different factors that play into it. But that's why I'm always very happy to hear that parents are at least willing to ask questions and have conversations about it, because it's at the end of the day, they still want to learn, even if they don't fully understand it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any, in the studies, is there any genetic tendency or heredofamilial tendency?
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to repeat that. My audio.
Oh, okay. No. Is there any kind of a heredofamilial tendencies or genetic transmissions? Any study has been done, genetics wise?
So there actually are a few. I can't cite them off the top of my head. I do know that there's one that has been looking at chromosomal spacing, actually, that has been talking about, and it's actually in a documentary that's on Netflix right now called Gender Revolution, ironically. And what it shows is that the chromosomal spacing, that sometimes there's gaps that may actually cause for someone to develop, again, like that psychological or mental development of the opposing sex versus how they were assigned at birth. Same thing with two other big ideas that are a lot more almost accepted in the community because there's more science behind it, which is the hormonal flush that you get while you're in the womb. Sometimes this has actually also been associated with sexuality as well, where the amount of hormonal flush of either estrogen or testosterone can help determine your sexuality. And if it goes above even that kind of like limitation that they've noticed for people who may turn out to identify as gay because of a testosterone flush they got in the womb, sometimes that can actually lead to identifying as a transgender man or as a trans female if it's the estrogen flush as well. These are, again, continuing studies, but very much promising in that area. And then the last one is, again, going back to that brain structure idea, which, very, very debatable in the science community, I know, because some people are like, no, there's no gender structure in the brain. Yes, there is. But what we have found is that, yes, there actually are differences between the male brain and female brain. And what's so funny now that we have identified non-binary is that they've actually found that those who are non-binary do have that mixture of structure in their brain as well. So MRI scans have actually been incredibly promising about showing that difference. But there are so many aspects that we have found that are going into this. And a lot of the studies have honestly been done in the past 10 years. It's been incredible to see how much the science has developed. So.
But your answer brings up another question. When you do the chromosomal study, would you find the XX or XY?
So so on both, it actually, the spacing both. So on XX chromosomes, you would see that detachment, that too much spacing between, maybe the secondary chromosome. And then for the XY, there may be too much growth or a mimic of growth by like how it's shaped in that Y chromosome is what kind of the theory is going on right now. The XY is not as solid of a theory because they're still trying to figure out why that is, because it's still different for some people, but they know for sure for transgender men like myself, what you're likely to see is like a gap between the XX that's like happening. So there might be a gap like right here that makes it like almost accidentally trick itself into thinking it's XY while still developing the person as XX.
Can you tell a little bit about the connection, difference between gender and sexuality? Because there are a lot of people who identify as pansexual, bisexual, and they get confused with non-binary people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I also get that question so many times because it can be very confusing. So excuse me for this phrasing is a little crude maybe, but this is the best way I have ever heard it explained, which is sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender identity is who you go to bed as. So gender identity and gender overall is just who you are when you wake up in the morning, how you see yourself in the mirror. Again, going back to that idea of self-image, versus sexual orientation is simply who you are attracted to, who you would like to marry, who you would like to date, all those things. Your gender identity will influence how you identify with your sexual orientation because, if I identify as male and I live as male and I date another man, then I would be identifying as a gay transgender man because my gender, I transition from female to male, so I am transgender, but I am attracted to other men and date other men as a man. Therefore, it would make it a gay relationship. So again, maybe a little crude, but who you go to bed with is your sexual orientation, who you go to bed as is your gender identity.
We commonly hear this term LGBT, and you mentioned it a couple of times, LGBT, and that's what a related question Ved had. And it's nice to kind of know exactly what LGBT means, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender.
Yeah, hi, Jason. I'm Dr. Rajpura. I work at University Counseling Center at Vanderbilt. So I have, like Dr. Patel had earlier asked a question about, and you responded, and that is my experience as well as a psychiatrist at the counseling center, that that the most students who identify and then they have sex transition, whether they start with the hormonal therapy or counseling or whatever it is. In my experience, almost always it has been that they change the name to more neutral, so their identity becomes different. So that is one thing. So second observation that I have made at counseling center is that still seems to be lots and lots of resistance in the families, right? So things are a lot better. Even in my short span that I've been at a counseling center, things seem to be progressing, but still there seems to be, especially in the students who come from typical, conservative families, that they universally tell me that there are issues that we don't talk about. So it is like, there's the Clintonian policy of don't ask, don't tell. That doesn't serve any purpose for the student. Actually, it makes it very uncomfortable. And most of them avoid going to, going home with the family because there are, and invariably with sexual orientation, and those kind of uncomfortable discussions, there are political discussions that follow, and there are a lot of issues there. And many students actually, as you had earlier mentioned, they end up using substances. They have a lot of risk of depression. Another point I wanted to make was that there is a lot more to sexual orientation than just the sexual identity. It is just not that he, him, she, her, they, them. There are orientation also differs, and there needs to be many more discussions like this one. So there is more awareness and acceptance as to and comfort on the part of whatever sexual identity one has, rather than being that binary definition. So that were my observations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to say a note on that, which is I highly appreciate all the things that you pointed out. And it goes back to that point of science very rarely works in binaries. Like very few times will you look at, let's just say botany and flowers and say binarily they are only going to be pink or red or white. Like we know that there are pink flowers, we know that there are yellow flowers. Like, science and biology and all those things very rarely work in strict binaries. So yes, absolutely. And you're also correct in the fact that unfortunately my identity has been incredibly politicized as well. This is not unique. Unfortunately, we have seen it with so many communities, including the Muslim community, who have been incredibly politicized and used as scapegoats in recent years as well. And it's an important conversation to have because of those things, that because sometimes people will learn from whatever, news outlets that they read or watch on a daily basis, that I am the enemy, that I am the reason why, female sports are not being funded as they should, or that I am the reason why, bathrooms are unsafe or whatever it is. When in reality, it's like, well, you really can't blame one group of people, especially without any evidence behind that as well. But it's very easy to act on political basis and propagate fear instead of having those real conversations and deconstructing kind of like what we're doing today, maybe previous thoughts about how gender works or how sexuality works and things like that. So I really appreciate your points as well, especially working in the counseling center, and I hope to see you on campus soon.
Any other questions? Please unmute your mic when you're asking the questions. And there is one question in the chat room, and Dr. Patel has suggested that the PBS has this information on gender identity. And I think I've not seen this, but I think that would be a good PBS session to listen to. How long is that session, Jared?
Well, it's actually not a session, it's a something you can read online. They have like a map, and you can click on different parts of the world map that shows how transgender people actually is not something new. They are in different cultures, how they are accepted in different cultures, not just now, but in history. So you might want to click on that and find some more information. In India, we of course have the Hijra community, and there are other communities that we are all familiar with back home. So if you have time, you can go ahead and read that. But I think video is a lot better than reading, easier for people. So Jason, do you have a recorded lecture, or would you be willing to do one that I can share with my Indian physician community as well as the medical community at my hospitals where I work? Because I find myself very uneducated on this. Maybe I'm ashamed to find information and talk about it openly. Or do you have any references in a video kind of thing, half an hour to an hour? Because when you make it too long or too technical, people will not learn anything. So if you have any resources, you can share them with us.
I do know that this session is being recorded. I will definitely look, if you would like to put your email down, or I can share it with Mr. Pramod as well.
Yeah.
And he can share it with all of you as well. I can try and find and collect some resources that may be more helpful and more suitable for that. And then also just to let everyone know, I am more than happy to do any of these sessions at any time. I'm just gonna let you know I don't charge for them. So, because I want to make this accessible. So, and I'm gonna very quickly also, because you reminded me of something wonderful. So thank you for sharing that resource. I'm also putting in the chat what is called an equality map, and it shows actually all the United States, and it shows you the laws and kind of places where it may be more dangerous, or like there are laws passed that target certain gender identities, and list out what those laws are, so that it can kind of help you understand like some of the discrimination that the transgender people around you may be facing, especially here in the South, where they actually have a negative tally score for gender identity because there's no legal support for them. So I wanted to put that in the chat as well.
One thing, Jason, you might be interested in knowing is that as conservative as Indian society is, Hijra, they have been long known to exist, right? And actually their presence at the wedding or at the birth of the new child or whatever, their blessings were considered to be good omen.
Hijra,
So,
yeah. I was very, yeah.
Well, we have the mythology, Indian mythology.
Yeah.
We have Brihanala and Mahabharata.
yeah.
Yes, correct. Yes.
For those who identify as Hindi, I know that there is I believe, goddess who is also transgender or third gender as well. I think her name starts with an A. I'll put it in the email that I sent to Mr. Pramod, but I also remembered that there was also there's actually I do remember that there is a goddess who I think she is the god protecting those who identify with being third gender or outside binary. So
in Indian mythology?
In Hindi, yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Sorry.
I wanted you to explain a little bit about the controversy about postponing puberty on before puberty. There are some advocates in some states have approved it. Pediatric endocrinologists are sometimes in support of this. This idea of postponing the secondary sexual characteristics by hormone treatment until they're 18, where they can make the decision whether they want to develop those secondary sexual characteristics or not. Can you explain to the community a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, because that's also an incredibly important topic. So one of the ideas in the controversy that I think that people forget about is that in this decision that is made, it is not just the doctor, it is not just the parents, and it's not just the child. It is the entire team of people, including counselors as well, that are involved in this decision to use puberty blockers, which basically, if for those that may not know, puberty blockers do exactly. I think someone has. Turn it down, see if that helps. Yes. For some of those puberty blockers, basically just prevent puberty from occurring, the hormonal changes that would make, for example, someone like myself who went through female puberty, continue to produce those like reproductive organs, stuff like that, for males, that would masculinize their body as well. And by going on puberty blockers, you're deferring off that puberty and helping prevent the exacerbation of gender dysphoria. This decision is usually made when a child has already expressed horrible gender dysphoria before they have even reached puberty. And so going through puberty can actually bring on a sense of trauma and actually become traumatic for the child if they are already experiencing it at that age, at that level, to where they need that kind of medical intervention. Going through puberty can cause a lot of psychological damage and cause all those things that we see. As far as I'm aware of, there has not been any solid science outside of one British medical journal that had a very small subject group that was questionable at most, that said that puberty blockers were not safe. And the thing that they pointed to was just the fact that it's like, it could possibly increase risk. Did not actually give scientific evidence for actually increasing risk of any kind of like sexual cancer or any kind of reproductive issues later in life. It just kind of makes that assumption that it could potentially. The benefit out at the end of the day, if everyone is making this decision together, definitely outweighs the fault. And at any time, a child, especially with puberty blockers, can stop. With hormone replacement therapy, which would be like injecting testosterone or taking estrogen pills, stuff like that, which happen later, that is a little bit harder to stop because you can't just sudden stop for your body. You have to kind of like get off of it just to make sure that there's not a huge like hormonal storm. But for puberty blockers, you would just be allowing puberty to happen. The only thing that is negative, that is for sure negative, is the potential societal effects or those social effects, because the child is not developing as normally as the rest of their peers. So it may seem a little strange, but usually they'll stop before the age of 16, because that's when you can usually start, a doctor will ethically consent to HRT. So by then they just kind of look like a late bloomer. So at most there's like a social consequence, not really any medical pointable consequences. So I err on the side of, prevent the trauma, prevent the child developmental issues that come from experiencing that kind of trauma. And if everyone's in agreement, go for it.
Problem becomes, does an 11-year-old have a choice about how she wants to express herself, and where is the parental role, especially if one parent likes the idea, is going along with the idea, and the other parent does not?
Yes. So unfortunately, or not really unfortunately, and maybe unfortunately for the child, but legally, if both parents are have custody, then both parents have to consent. It does not matter if the parents are divorced. If they both have consent, if they both have custody, they both have to consent. If that is not possible for that child to get onto puberty blockers or HRT, At that point, doctors will usually look to try and help the parents understand a bit more, provide more education if they can, offer parental counseling, stuff like that to try and help them, especially if there's a conflict between the parents, because Lord have mercy. But yes, so it is a situation where both parents, if they have custody, have to consent.
This big problem comes in the sports, and especially the competitive sports in Olympics. One of the controversy was one of the female athlete. They were kind of banning because she may be transgender and have more testosterone hormone and more capacity to win the competition. And I think more and more things are going to come up about the competitive sports. NFL has one transgender sportsman in NFL, but that's working out okay. That's not a problem.
Yeah. I do want to note with that is that there's actually a very continuing study that is happening right now that's trying to understand more of the effects of HRT on athletes, like people who continue to be athletes throughout their transition. And there is one study that this particular study has been following a couple of people, especially trans women, for quite a few years. And what they found was that there actually was a lung for those trans women who were using and that they also had major muscle mass loss, which I've heard from trans women in my life as well as actually bone density loss as well. So it's actually funny. Trans women will be told to take calcium pills because of the bone density loss. And then trans men like myself will be told to drink orange juice and things like that to keep up their immune system, because testosterone, both in cisgender men and transgender men, lowers your immune system, ironically. So I just thought that was an interesting tidbit, is that there actually has been that shows that transgender women do lose some of that capacity.
Hello, I have a question.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me? Yes. This is on a personal level. If you know there is a family with child who is going through this stage, is it appropriate for us to ask a question, or should we wait until they're ready to go open up on that? Because I want to let them know I'm supportive and caring and they can talk to me, but at the same time, I don't want to intrude until they are ready to speak.
Yeah, and I completely understand. That's actually another question I get quite a bit, because it can be kind of complicated. I think the two biggest measures are, who you're thinking of, and so your relationship to that person better than I do. And so it comes down to that personal relationship at the end of the day. But if you're still not sure how to open up that conversation, then one of the things that you can start with is just asking them what pronouns they use. Just asking, hey, I've just noticed a few changes over the past few months. Are you using different pronouns that I can refer to you as, or a different name that I can refer to you as? That's a great way to comfortably open the conversation, and allows for them to either continue it and go further, or, just stop it right there, but know that you are a supportive person.
This helps me, because not knowing the right thing to say, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. That's why I need to know exactly how much I should say or not say.
Yeah, and I definitely I definitely understand that. The biggest thing that I err on the side of is that naturally we are going to make mistakes. Showing your support is more than if I'm being honest, as a trans person, especially in the South, if I know that somebody is trying their best and going in with good conscience, I am not going to be angry at them for if they make a mistake or not. So opening that conversation about pronouns or name is great. And you can also just say if it does feel like they are continuing the conversation, or that they feel happy that you asked them that, you can simply say what you just told me, which is that I just want you to know that if you ever want to talk about anything, you can come talk to me and I support you. if I heard that, I think I would start crying because that would be so great.
Any other questions? You briefly mentioned about the restroom problems, but recently I have noticed that several hospitals and doctors' offices, they don't have separate restrooms for women and men. So that eliminates the problem with you're transgender or not. And I wish, of course, the problem is going to come with a larger gathering, like a sporting event to 400, 500 people. They cannot have individual restrooms. So that's going to be a problem. But that's been an issue all over the country about this restrooms for transgender people.
I will say that sometimes a good thing to offer, especially like sports facilities, or also, so I work at the YMCA as well, the gym downtown, and they actually have family locker rooms, in which especially for transgender folks who may not feel comfortable going into the male or female restroom, they can use that as well. As long as no one else is using it, and there's a few that are offered. So I've actually seen at Bridgestone, I think they actually have a few separate gender neutral restrooms now, along with the large 20 stall restrooms for the arena. So so we're definitely making progress.
Any other questions? If not, that was a great presentation. Give a good hand to Jason. Of course, several of them are muted. Now, this session has been recorded. It's a cloud recording. It comes very well, and I really enjoy seeing the cloud recording next day. You can really fast forward, and it's very clear. And Jason has agreed to share this recording with you all. So if you have any friends or family who wants to listen to this, who couldn't attend it today, please let me know, and I'll share the recording, Zoom recording, to you all tomorrow. And as we do these sessions every month, so the next month in July, second Saturday, we'll have a healthcare topics. And we are also going to have a very interesting speaker, Dhruv Purohit, who has been a very outstanding young man, has a big podcast, is supposed to be the top 5 podcast. He has some excellent topics and excellent speakers. So hope you can join at that time. And I guess Jason is willing to address this again to any other groups. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And I've also put my email in the chat for if anyone else has any questions that come up after this, or again, also if you would like for me to come talk to another group or anything, feel free to contact me at any time. So.
Okay,
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, one more time, can I request everybody to attend the movie at Brentwood Library on June 19th at 3:30.
June
Thank you.
19, it's starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And
3:15 we'll see it. Yeah.
Yeah, 3:15.
Yes.
And you'll get some, you already received those flyers, but
Yes.
you'll get some more information on that. And I hope we'll get a big crowd. And one more thing, Uma, I need to mention about that we should make this session a mandatory mask. Mandatory mask.
Yes, I'm going to get some masks also.
Yeah,
to
because
keep there for those who did not.
we
Yes,
had a
sir.
sad situation with a recent friend's wedding. Several of them.
Oh my
came
God.
down.
No, I have my mask right here,
No,
even in
but,
the car.
I mean, it's a crowd psychology, because 300 people there in the crowd. Everybody was carrying a mask in the pocket, but then they saw nobody is using the mask. So, we should not use the mask.
No, I think when I send the next reminder, I will put it. Please.
Yeah, please. I
Masking
think
is- yes.
mask is mandatory.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
right now the CDC has also said that for group gatherings, they're encouraging masks again because there's an uptick in
Yes.
cases as well as hospitalization. So especially where a lot of seniors are present and not a young college crowd, I think
Yes.
I would highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, and I'll end this session. And hope
Thank you,
you
Jay.
have a nice holidays, a nice weekend, and enjoy them. Okay, thank you. Okay,
Thank you
bye.
for coordinating. Thanks a lot. Enjoy.